The morning frost clung to the marble steps of the Russian embassy in Washington, D.C. like a bitter memory. Ambassador Viktor Sokolov adjusted his wool coat and quickened his pace past the figure huddled near the service entrance. He had walked these same steps for 3 years now and had grown accustomed to seeing her there, the homeless woman with silver hair and worn blankets who never asked for anything, never spoke, never even looked up. But this particular November morning something made Viktor pause. Perhaps it was the way the early light caught her face. Perhaps it was the weight of the letter in his briefcase, the one from Moscow that had arrived overnight informing him that his mother was ill, that her memory was fading, that she sometimes called out for people who no longer existed. The woman shifted slightly, and her blanket fell away, revealing a tarnished locket around her neck. Viktor found himself staring. It was identical to one his grandmother had worn, the same delicate filigree pattern, the same old Russian craftsmanship that you could not find anymore. Before he could stop himself, he spoke in Russian. Not the formal diplomatic Russian he used in meetings, but the warm kitchen Russian of his childhood. The language of his grandmother's fairy tales. "Where did you get that locket?" The woman's head snapped up. Her eyes were the palest blue Viktor had ever seen, clear and sharp despite the dirt on her face and the tangles in her hair. For a long moment she simply stared at him. Then in flawless Russian with an accent that placed her somewhere near St. Petersburg, she replied, "My mother gave it to me." Before everything disappeared, Viktor felt the world tilt slightly. Embassy staff were arriving now. His assistant was calling his name. But he could not move, could not look away from this woman who spoke his language with the grammar of someone educated. Someone who had once been something other than invisible. "What is your name?" he asked. The woman hesitated, pulled the blanket tighter. "Names do not matter much anymore. But once I was called Katarina. I was called Katya." Throughout that day, Viktor could not concentrate. During the morning briefing, he kept seeing those pale blue eyes. During lunch with the trade delegation, he kept hearing that perfect Russian syntax. During the afternoon calls with Moscow, he kept thinking about the locket, about his grandmother, about his mother whose memory was slipping away like water through fingers. That evening, Viktor did something he had never done before. He left the embassy through the service entrance. He carried a thermos of hot tea and a bag with bread and cheese. Katarina was still there, wrapped in her blankets like a cocoon against the cold. He sat down beside her on the steps, his expensive suit against the dirty concrete, his diplomatic credentials in his pocket meaning nothing at all. "Tell me," he said simply, in Russian. "Tell me how someone who speaks like a professor ends up on these steps." Katarina was silent for so long that Viktor thought she would not answer. Then slowly, like ice beginning to thaw, she began to speak. She had been a translator once. She told him this in a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 losses. She had come to America in the 1990s as part of a cultural exchange program. Young and brilliant and full of dreams, she had fallen in love with an American man, a journalist. They married. She stayed. For years life was beautiful. She worked at university. She translated Russian literature, Pushkin, Tolstoy, Akhmatova. She helped American students fall in love with the language that sang in her blood. Her husband wrote important stories. They had a small apartment in Georgetown filled with books and music and hope. Then came the accident, a drunk driver on a rainy night. Her husband died instantly, and Katarina shattered like glass. The grief was a living thing that consumed everything. She could not work, could not eat, could not remember how to be human. The bills piled up. The apartment was lost. Her visa status became complicated because she could not navigate the paperwork through the fog of her mourning. She slipped through the cracks. Those terrible cracks that exist in every society where people fall and keep falling until they hit concrete. Literally, the shelters were full or dangerous or required documentation she no longer had. She learned to survive on the streets, learned to be invisible. The brilliant translator became a ghost, and ghosts do not speak, because who would listen? Who would believe that the woman in dirty blankets once taught Dostoevsky to eager minds? Viktor listened with tears freezing on his cheeks. He thought of his mother, of how quickly a person could be lost, of how fragile the line was between a life of meaning and a life of nothing. He came back the next evening, and the next. Each time he brought food and tea. Each time they spoke in Russian, about literature, about memory, about the weight of exile even when exile is chosen. Katarina began to unfold. Her sentences grew longer, her eyes brighter. She recited poetry from memory, entire stanzas of Pushkin that Viktor had forgotten. Within the embassy, Viktor began making quiet inquiries. There was a cultural attaché position available. It required native Russian fluency and deep cultural knowledge. It paid modestly but came with housing, with stability, with a chance to matter again. But there were problems. Katarina had no current identification, no permanent address, no way to prove she was who she said she was. The bureaucracy was a maze and Viktor was running out of time. His replacement was arriving in 2 months. He would return to Moscow to be with his mother. Then one evening Katarina showed him what was inside the locket. A tiny photograph, faded and creased. A young woman standing in front of the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad. On the back was written a name and a date, documentation, proof, a thread connecting past to present. Viktor worked frantically. He called in favors. He contacted immigration lawyers. He reached out to the university where Katarina had once worked and found records. A professor who remembered her brilliance. Students whose lives she had changed. Slowly, carefully, he built a case. A pathway back. The embassy staff watched in confusion as their reserved ambassador spent his evenings on the steps, watched as he fought bureaucracy with the same intensity he brought to diplomatic negotiations. Some whispered that he had lost his mind. Others began to understand that they were witnessing something rare. Humanity trumping protocol. 6 weeks later, Katarina walked into the Russian embassy through the front door. She wore donated clothes that almost fit. Her hair was clean and cut. She carried identification papers that Viktor had helped her obtain. She interviewed for the cultural attaché position in Russian so pure and beautiful that the panel sat in stunned silence. They offered her the job immediately. The day Viktor left for Moscow, the entire embassy staff gathered to see him off. But first they gathered to celebrate. Katarina stood at a podium in the embassy hall. She wore professional clothes. She held papers without shaking. She gave a presentation on contemporary Russian literature that left diplomats and staff members equally moved. When she finished, Viktor embraced her. In Russian, he whispered, "Thank you for reminding me why any of this matters. Why we build bridges, why we see each other." Katarina whispered back, "You saved my life." Viktor shook his head. "No, you saved mine. You reminded me that behind every invisible person is a story. A history, a human being who deserves to be seen." The embassy erupted in applause. People who had walked past Katarina for years without seeing her now understood what they had missed. The diplomat who had seemed cold and distant had shown them something about compassion that transcended politics and nationality. Viktor returned to Moscow to care for his mother, but he carried with him the memory of pale blue eyes and perfect Russian. The reminder that kindness is not weakness, that seeing people truly seeing them is the most important diplomacy of all. Katarina thrived. She rebuilt her life one day at a time. She translated documents. She taught language classes. She spoke at universities about Russian culture. She became a bridge between worlds again. And every morning she touched the locket around her neck and remembered that even in the deepest darkness there are people who will sit beside you on cold steps and listen. Sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply see someone, really see them, behind the blankets and the dirt and the invisibility we create for people we find uncomfortable. There are stories. There are souls. There are human beings who deserve dignity and kindness and a chance to matter again. If this story touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Pure Kindness Stories. Share this with someone who needs to remember that every person has value. That compassion can change everything. That the smallest act of seeing someone, truly seeing them, can save a life. Together we can build a world where no one is invisible, where everyone gets a chance to come home to themselves. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being the kind of person who believes that kindness matters.